Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a former law enforcement officer in Alaska and the author of the book 50 Shades of True Crime. His name is Douglas Fifer, and my interview with Doug will follow the teleportation sound. Due to discussion of sexuality, listener discretion for this episode is advised. Doug Fifer, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is Doug Fifer. I'm born and raised in Homer, Alaska. That's a small town about 270 miles south of Anchorage, which is our largest city. So I've grown up my whole life in Alaska. Love it. It's the most beautiful place on earth. And in 1996, for a profession, I went into law enforcement. And I did 25 years as an Anchorage police officer, pretty much doing every type of special teams, any type of work law enforcement can do. I did it in the 25 years. And then after retiring, I had some really interesting stories regarding sexual deviants on the extreme side. And when I would tell people these stories, they would say, you should write a book. Ultimately, when I retired, I wrote the book, which is called 50 Shades of True Crime. And it's been doing very well.
As this question might better understand your book, what motivated you to become a law enforcement officer?
Well, what was interesting is my dad's side of the family was from Maryland, so we would travel back during the holidays and during the summer months and visit family. And I remember he took me to the Baltimore Orioles baseball stadium just to show us the stadium, because in Alaska, we don't have any pro sports. So it's kind of neat as a kid to see this giant stadium. And we were around the backside where you're not allowed to be. And this Maryland trooper stopped us and said, "Hey, what are you guys doing? You're not supposed to be here." So my dad told him that, "Hey, we're all from Alaska, just showing my kids the stadium. It's kind of cool." He said, "Well, why don't you buy tickets?" And at the time, my parents couldn't afford it. So the trooper let us in the back of the building to his private security spot. And he said, "Go ahead and watch the rest of the game." And the door locks on the way out. And I remember as a little kid, I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And so I kind of looked at him like a superhero. He's in this cool uniform, big guy, very nice to us. We got to watch the Orioles play. My first professional baseball game as an Alaska kid. And I thought, someday that when I grow up, that's what I want to be. And that's exactly what I became.
Your book is a nonfiction book called 50 Shades of True Crime. Without spoiling too much of your book, what is it about?
Well, it's certainly a play off the book 50 Shades of Grey. But what it does, in the 25 years, I took the most extreme sexually deviant cases that I ever investigated, and I put it into a book. So it starts off, there's a chapter that's called Name That Crime. The reader kind of plays along with the actual true crime cases, and you kind of guess what the crime is. You read through it, and you'll find out at the end. So it's more of an interactive with the reader. You're going to see how good you would be as a detective, spotting like little nuances with criminals. And then it gets, it amps up after that. But this isn't the normal type of sexual deviant crimes. It's definitely the most extreme that you would see on anywhere.
Tell our listeners more about Alaska, and more specifically, why Alaska attracts a lot of criminals to move there.
Well, that's a question we've been trying to answer in law enforcement for a long time. I would tell you, I think that most criminals that come up, especially serial killers, and I've worked a lot of cases on serial killers, when they come to Alaska, it's a small population, 700,000, comparatively to the size of the landmass. If you put us on the lower 48 map, we cover, about a third of the nation. We're 2.5 times the size of Texas. So Alaska geographically is massive. So I think that serial killers think that that's a large, vast area that they can dispose of bodies. They think that probably our law enforcement isn't as sophisticated as elsewhere, which is incorrect. But they think this, so they come up, they commit those crimes. Alaska per capita has the most serial killers on planet Earth due to our small population. But I think that's a big part of it. Our motto is it's the land of the free. We're very independent. So I think we attract those individuals who maybe don't fit in society elsewhere. They come to Alaska thinking that they're going to fit in.
Now, as part of your experience in law enforcement, you've actually negotiated with a serial killer. What is it like on the law enforcement side of things to negotiate with a serial killer?
Well, I love negotiations. It's my favorite thing that I ever did in law enforcement. It came natural. I think just talking to people, the gift of gab, that's what I had. So talking to the serial killer is no different than me talking to you. What I would say is most people don't realize most serial killers have a high intellect. They're not dumb people. So it's a cat and mouse game that you play with them psychologically to try and get them out without harming any other individuals. In the case, my serial killer, his name was Joshua Wade. He had killed multiple victims. He had run from the police and taken two hostages. I was called on the scene, so I had to talk him out safely. He'd already committed multiple murders. It wouldn't be far-fetched for him to commit some more. I was able, through negotiations, to talk that individual out. What he wanted was not to be hurt by our SWAT team, of course. And then, although he preyed upon victims, he was very afraid of being harmed himself. So we used that against him. So what you want to do is you want to have a negotiation where they think they're winning a little bit, but they come out and they effectively don't get much. And in essence, he got a jail sentence of 130 years.
What is the typical psyche behind a deviant sexual offender like the ones that you write about in 50 Shades of True Crime?
I wish I could specifically say one item, but what I'll tell you, if you read the book, these can be business owners, these can be politicians, these can be your next door neighbor, these can be school teachers. These are everybody across the gamut of society. So I can't individualize on what the psyche might be behind the suspect, those individuals. It's all over the spectrum, and the deviant crimes encompass all of society. And while Alaska is quite unique, and we have some really odd and interesting stories, it's throughout the US and worldwide as well.
How long did it take you to write 50 Shades of True Crime?
After retiring, I took the summer and I wrote it in about 90 days. Keep in mind, I'd worked most of these cases myself, so this is information that's locked into your brain. And the true crime cases are so unusual. It's something that the readers or myself as a seasoned law enforcement officer would never forget. So the book writing was fairly easy on that aspect just because I had lived through each and every one of these cases and they were cemented in my memory.
What are the easiest and hardest aspects of writing a book for you?
Well, I think the easiest for me was writing it. And again, that's because I lived these cases. The hardest aspect was actually publishing the book. So writing it was one thing. I went through about 6 publishers. Now, again, the book's pretty savage and raw. There's nothing taken out of it. It's all pure law enforcement information. So it goes straight to the point. A lot of publishers didn't like that. It was a little too strong for them. So it took me 6 publishers, which took about 18 months in negotiations. They would think about it. They would come back and they're like, we like the book, but it's a little too strong for our membership, our readers. We're going to pass. I go on to the next one. It would take time. The next one, the next one. I almost gave up, to be honest with you, because I thought nobody's going to publish this book. Finally, I found a publisher that said, love to publish it. And the rest is history.
What was the publisher that ended up publishing your book?
Yeah, the current publisher I work with is Ballast Publishing.
Do you have more true crime books in the works? And if so, could you give our listeners a preview of any books you have in the works at any stage of development?
Yeah, the next book will be about Alaska serial killers, since I was so intimate with those investigations and especially with negotiating with one of them. Kind of a cool aspect of this next coming book on serial killers, the Joshua Wade character that I mentioned to you earlier that I negotiated with. I actually reached out to him post-retirement recently and have recorded conversations of him in prison. He was convicted of only 2 homicides, admitted to 5, probably good for 12 or 13. So in these communications while he's incarcerated in prison, I get a lot of additional information on possible homicides that he committed. He really tells all in these communications. That's the next book. And of course, on the website and in the audiobook, you'll get to hear live and virtual from a serial killer.
Now, this is a question that this might be the only time I ever ask someone who's worked in law enforcement this question, But do you really have teachable tidbits about sex to share with our listeners? And if so, what are some of them?
Yeah, that's a funny thing. The book is so extreme and it's pretty hardcore that the reader at the end needs a little break from reality because mankind can be pretty savage. I know this working 25 years as a cop. So at the end, what I did is I took a fun chapter called Teachable Tidbits, and those are sexual things that I learned as an investigator in Alaska, what couples might do or individuals that is perfectly legal. You might not think about it and you can incorporate in your sex life. Now, some may like it, some may not, but these aren't criminal acts. What these are things through investigations that I discovered that personally and professionally I never knew about. But they're quite interesting, and I'm sure some of the readers will incorporate them, undoubtedly. So some are soft, some are a little bit stronger, but they're all over the spectrum of sex, and they're all real life cases. So in the book, I explain where they came from, how I found out in my investigations about them. And it's kind of up to the individual reader or individual if they want to incorporate it.
One final question to close out this interview. Can you give our listeners some advice for protecting themselves in everyday life and protecting themselves from sexual predators if they have to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll give the advice I give. I have two daughters. I'll give the same advice I give my two daughters. I always have my entire life, my entire career is follow your gut. If something feels odd or wrong, then do something to protect yourself. What I find in victims is overwhelmingly they knew something was wrong, but they thought another individual wouldn't harm them. They wouldn't bother them. Whether that's walking out of an elevator into a dark parking garage, whether somebody's following you and you decide to keep walking instead of going someplace public, any of those things, when your gut tells you something's wrong, follow it and trust your gut and seek out safety. That's the best advice I can give you. Law enforcement can't always protect you. That's just a fact. So you're the best person to protect yourself. So when in doubt, follow your gut, seek safety. Tell my daughters the same thing.
Doug, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an interesting guest.
Well, Aaron, I appreciate you having me. And for readers interested in Alaska true crime, please check out my book, 50 Shades of True Crime. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, the Audible, Kindle, whatever you like to read, it's there. Check it out, see what you think.
That was an amazing and interesting interview. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.